I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
Windsor had survived scandals, feuds, and years of carefully managed royal tension. But this dinner collapsed in a matter of seconds. Catherine sat humiliated. Anne suddenly pushed back her chair, and the room went silent. Then came the move nobody expected. The Princess Royal shut the evening down. Before courtiers could even recover, Camilla demanded a formal palace inquiry into what had happened, and who had allowed the confrontation to spiral beyond control. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles watched the silence spread across the table, and he knew the damage was no longer private. This had been meant to be a Windsor family dinner, attended by King Charles, Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, Prince William, Catherine, and a small circle of senior household figures. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had spent most of the evening saying little. But when Camilla made a cutting remark that diminished Catherine's standing in front of the room, restraint ended. Catherine lowered her eyes and gripped the edge of the table, forcing herself not to react. William saw the movement immediately. He knew one angry sentence could turn humiliation into a family fracture, yet saying nothing felt almost as painful. Camilla remained composed, but the queen consort had made the remark in a room where every pause carried weight. Anne did not wait for anyone else to intervene. She pushed back her chair, stood, and said the dinner was over. The decision hit Charles harder than the tension itself. He understood that his sister was not merely protecting Catherine. She was drawing a boundary inside the family, and everyone present knew it. A palace inquiry, in plain terms, is an internal review used to establish what happened, who acted, and whether household rules were broken. Minutes after leaving the dining room, Camilla told a senior aide she wanted exactly that. She wanted Anne's authority questioned, and she wanted the handling of the dinner examined. Less than 20 minutes later, Charles received a handwritten summary of the demand. He read it once, then again, before placing it down without speaking. William stayed nearby, watching the monarch's expression harden. The future king understood the danger. An inquiry into Anne's decision could not avoid the words that triggered it. To examine why the dinner ended, the palace would have to examine what Camilla had said to Catherine first. And suddenly, the question was no longer why Anne ended the dinner. It was how far Camilla was prepared to go once the palace began examining the moment that caused it. Behind the formal titles were 5 people carrying very different fears. Catherine feared being diminished in a family she had spent years serving. William feared another fracture he could never repair. Anne feared silence becoming complicity. Camilla feared losing authority inside the household. And Charles faced the most painful possibility of all, that maintaining peace between the people closest to him might now be impossible, without choosing which version of loyalty he valued most. Catherine had spent years learning when to speak, and when silence protected something larger than herself. That restraint mattered, because her place within the royal family depended not only on rank, but on trust, discipline, and the ability to survive private tensions without turning them into public battles. Anne understood that instinct better than most. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally held by the sovereign's eldest daughter, respected hierarchy deeply, yet she believed duty meant stepping in when dignity was being stripped away in plain sight. William found Catherine after midnight, still carrying the weight of what had happened. She removed a bracelet, placed it carefully on the table, and finally said what she had refused to say at dinner. "I can handle criticism. I cannot keep pretending humiliation is protocol." The prince took her hand, but struggled to answer. He knew she was not describing one cruel remark. She was describing a pattern, and that frightened him far more. Camilla carried a different wound into her private conversation with Charles. She believed Anne had publicly undermined her position as queen, and she told the king that allowing a senior royal to shut down a gathering without consequence would weaken the structure surrounding the crown. In simple terms, the crown here meant the authority and institutional order attached to the reigning monarch, not merely a ceremonial object. Charles listened carefully, but he also understood the dangerous contradiction. Defending structure meant examining what had caused Anne to break with it. Anne received confirmation of Camilla's inquiry request through a documented message from a senior household aide. She did not panic. She did not soften her position. Instead, she calmly replied that if formally questioned, she would repeat every word she had said at Windsor and explain exactly why she had said it. Her certainty unsettled the palace because it suggested she believed the facts would protect her. Charles now saw the trap clearly. If investigators examined Anne, they would have to examine Catherine's humiliation. If they examined that, they would need Camilla's exact wording. And once those words were placed beside witness accounts, every reaction at the table would become part of the record. William felt another concern forming. Catherine suddenly remembered an uncomfortable exchange with Camilla only days earlier, one she had originally dismissed as tension over royal responsibilities. Now it looked different, much different, and buried beneath that painful admission was the incident that had made Windsor combustible before anyone ever took their seat. The Windsor dinner had not created the fracture, it merely exposed it. 3 days earlier, during a private planning meeting, Catherine had challenged a proposed change affecting one of her future royal initiatives. Camilla answered with a sentence that several people remembered immediately. It sounded procedural in the moment. By the night of the dinner, however, that same dispute had become personal, and one exchange would later be remembered as the unmistakable point of no return. Catherine had been preparing a forthcoming royal initiative when tension first sharpened over who should control its final presentation. Camilla wanted more decisions routed through her household, believing closer coordination would stop senior royal offices from sending mixed signals. A royal household, in simple terms, is the team of aides and officials who organize a royal figure's work, communication, and official duties. Catherine saw the proposed change differently. To her, it felt like unnecessary interference in work she had spent months shaping. 3 days before the dinner, Catherine sat across from Camilla in a small Windsor briefing room and refused a proposed wording change. The Queen Consort did not raise her voice. She simply told her that she needed to remember which household sets the final tone. Catherine closed her folder and left without answering. The silence mattered because she had spent years avoiding open conflict, yet this time the remark followed her out of the room. William heard about the exchange later that day. Catherine told him privately that the words made her feel less like a future queen and more like a junior royal being reminded of her place. The prince's anger came quickly, but he urged patience until he knew whether Charles had actually supported the intervention. If the king had authorized it, the dispute was institutional. If he had not, something much more personal was happening. Anne learned about the conversation before the Windsor dinner and asked Catherine whether she wanted her to step in. The Princess Royal received a firm refusal. Catherine insisted that she did not want a disagreement over responsibilities turned into a family confrontation. Anne respected that decision, but she remembered the wording. Then, dinner changed everything. Camilla returned to the disputed initiative and suggested that Catherine had begun confusing public affection with authority. The future queen fell silent. Anne did not. That was the instant she decided the boundary had been crossed. Hours later, a secretary confirmed through a documented internal account that Charles had never approved the phrase used during the earlier briefing. Anne read the confirmation carefully and understood what it meant. Camilla's warning had carried the weight of royal authority without the king ever giving it. By morning, the dispute had moved beyond memory and interpretation. Anne wanted Camilla in the same room, with Charles present, and no one hiding behind protocol. The meeting began without raised voices, but everyone inside the room understood that restraint could disappear at any moment. Camilla wanted an explanation. Anne had brought one. Charles sat between two women who had each convinced themselves they were defending the monarchy. Then Camilla demanded to know why a princess had presumed to terminate a dinner hosted under the sovereign's roof. Anne leaned forward, looked directly at her, and answered with a sentence that stripped away every layer of royal ceremony. Charles had arranged the private meeting before the formal inquiry could gather momentum. He wanted one chance to keep the dispute inside the family, before officials, statements, and written accounts hardened every position. For the first 15 minutes, the king deliberately excluded aides. A formal inquiry, in simple terms, is an internal examination used to establish what happened and whether palace procedures were broken. But this conversation was not about procedure yet. It was about hurt, authority, and who had failed to act when Catherine was humiliated. Camilla spoke first. She asked Anne whether she truly believed she had the authority to end a Windsor dinner. The Princess Royal did not hesitate. She said she acted because nobody else had stopped Catherine from being diminished in front of the entire table. The Queen Consort pushed back, insisting the exchange had been a legitimate discussion about responsibility. Anne answered that responsibility did not excuse humiliation, and tone mattered when one royal used rank to make another feel smaller. Charles finally interrupted. He asked for the exact words spoken at dinner. Anne repeated them slowly, including the remark suggesting Catherine had confused public affection with authority. The king's expression changed almost immediately. He had already read a written account of the evening, but that sentence had not appeared in it. The version reaching him had softened the confrontation into a disagreement over protocol, leaving out the line that had triggered the collapse. Camilla felt the ground shift beneath her argument. She had demanded an inquiry because she believed it would expose Anne's overreach. Now the same process threatened to expose differences between what had actually been said and what the sovereign had been told afterward. She gripped the arm of her chair but did not interrupt. Anne finished speaking and folded her hands. Her anger was obvious, yet her voice stayed controlled. Charles looked from his sister to his wife and made the decision neither expected. He would not cancel the inquiry. He would expand it. The king ordered officials to establish who prepared the first written account, who approved its wording, and why the most important sentence had disappeared. What began as Camilla's demand for accountability was now becoming Charles's search for whoever had tried to shape his understanding of the night. Royal power rarely announces itself with shouting. More often, it appears in amended notes, changed schedules, private access, and the quiet authority to decide what reaches the sovereign's desk. That was why Charles's next decision mattered. Rather than asking who had been offended, he ordered officials to reconstruct the Windsor dinner minute by minute. Suddenly, the crisis became less about personalities and more about something far more dangerous. Who had tried to control the record afterward? Charles understood how much influence could hide inside ordinary palace paperwork. Private secretaries and household officials prepare summaries, arrange access, and record decisions for senior royals, which means they can shape how an event is understood before anyone makes a judgment. An inaccurate briefing could therefore turn a painful family argument into an institutional crisis. If the king acted on a distorted account, the damage would spread far beyond one dinner. William wanted the inquiry finished quickly. Catherine had already endured the humiliation itself, and the prince hated the idea of courtiers repeatedly discussing the moment, as if her pain were evidence to be examined. He pressed his father to close the matter before it consumed the family. Charles refused. The monarch told him that ending the review too soon would leave the altered account unexplained, and once confidence in palace records was damaged, every future decision could be questioned. Camilla felt the investigation tightening around her own household. She told Charles that what began as an examination of Anne's conduct was becoming an inquiry into people close to her. The Queen Consort wanted the original question restored. Who had given Anne the right to stop the dinner? The king answered quietly that the inquiry had to follow the evidence created by Camilla's own demand. That response landed hard. She had opened the door, and now she could no longer decide where it led. Officials soon produced the first written summary of the confrontation. It described what happened as a disagreement over dinner protocol, completely omitting Catherine's humiliation. A second draft prepared later that night restored part of the exchange, but the sharpest sentence attributed to Camilla, the suggestion that Catherine had confused popularity with authority, was still missing. Charles read both versions alone. He placed them side by side, removed his glasses, and studied the difference without speaking. Then he circled the missing passage with a pen and asked one simple question: who approved the edits? The answer changed the mood instantly. The name attached to the revision belonged to an official with direct access to Camilla's office. She now faced an unsettling possibility. Someone may have tried to protect her without ever being asked. The first consequence would not fall on Anne or Catherine. It would land inside the household that had demanded the investigation. By the second evening, Windsor no longer felt like the site of one disastrous dinner. It had become the center of a family reckoning. Catherine had withdrawn from a scheduled private gathering. Anne refused to soften her account. William stopped communicating through intermediaries. And Camilla, who had demanded a formal examination, believing it would vindicate her position, received the news she least expected. One member of her own household had been temporarily removed from sensitive duties. Charles made the decision after reviewing both versions of the altered summary. The official responsible would no longer handle direct royal briefings until the inquiry was complete. Direct royal briefings are the private reports prepared for senior members of the monarchy so they can make decisions based on a clear account of events. The suspension was administrative. Not a declaration of guilt, but its meaning was impossible to miss. Someone had changed what reached the king, and the palace could no longer pretend that was a minor detail. Camilla reacted with wounded anger. She asked Charles why someone inside her office was being removed when Anne had been the person who openly stopped the dinner. The Queen Consort believed the investigation had abandoned its original purpose. The king answered without raising his voice. The inquiry, he said, could not punish defiance while ignoring distortion. If Anne's actions were going to be examined, then the information used to judge those actions had to be trustworthy. Catherine received the news from William and felt no satisfaction. The prince expected relief, perhaps even vindication, but she instead became visibly uncomfortable. She told him she had never wanted another household pulled apart because of what happened to her. William understood the conflict immediately. She wanted accountability, but she did not want revenge. That difference mattered, because the family was rapidly beginning to treat the crisis as a contest with winners and losers. The suspended official finally explained the edits in a documented interview with investigators. They said the language had been softened because they feared the original version would trigger a direct confrontation between Charles and Camilla. More importantly, the official denied receiving any instruction from the Queen. That partly cleared her of deliberately altering the record, but it exposed something more painful. People around her believed protecting her required changing what the king saw. Camilla sat alone after Charles left the room. She reached toward the inquiry folder, stopped, then pushed it away. For the first time since demanding the review, anger gave way to something quieter. She was shaken by what her own household had believed necessary. Anne saw the opening immediately. Reconciliation was still possible, but only if Catherine's humiliation was acknowledged without turning the apology into another argument over status. The machinery of the palace had done all it could. What remained could only be settled in a room where titles, aides, and official summaries could no longer protect anyone. No secretaries entered. No briefing papers were placed on the table. No one waited outside to translate emotion into palace language. Catherine and Camilla met privately, because both finally understood that another official intervention would only deepen the damage. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Catherine did something more difficult than anger. She calmly described exactly how the Windsor dinner had made her feel, and forced Camilla to hear the difference between an argument over authority and the humiliation of another human being. Charles had encouraged the meeting, but he refused to attend. The king believed reconciliation would mean nothing if the two women could only speak honestly with the sovereign acting as referee. A sovereign, in simple terms, is the reigning monarch who carries the final constitutional and symbolic authority of the crown. Anne also stayed away. Before Catherine entered, the Princess Royal told her quietly that defending someone did not mean speaking for them forever. Catherine began without accusation. She told Camilla that the dispute had never been only about hierarchy, wording, or who controlled a royal initiative. She could accept disagreement. She could accept correction. What she could not accept was being made to feel deliberately smaller in front of family while everyone watched. The future queen said the humiliation came not from being challenged, but from being challenged in a way that seemed designed to remind her of where she stood. Camilla listened longer than Catherine expected. Then the queen consort admitted something of her own. Anne ending the dinner had made her feel publicly rejected inside a family where she had spent years fighting to establish legitimacy. She had heard the chair move, seen the gathering collapse, and felt as though the room had chosen against her in a single instant. Catherine did not dismiss that pain, but she refused to let it erase what came first. Catherine then revealed, through their private conversation, that Anne had offered to intervene 3 days before the dinner, and she had refused. She had wanted to prevent confrontation, not provoke it. Camilla went quiet. That detail changed the meaning of everything. The princess had been given a chance to escalate the disagreement, and had deliberately chosen restraint. Camilla finally acknowledged that her remark at dinner had gone further than necessary. She said the conversation should have happened privately, and accepted responsibility for creating the moment that pushed Anne to act. She still believed the dinner should not have been stopped in that way, but she no longer pretended the cause was separate from her own words. Catherine stood first. Camilla rose moments later. There was no embrace. The queen simply said, "I should not have put you in that position." Catherine answered, "That was what I needed you to understand." With the personal truth finally spoken, Charles could now close the inquiry. But the public was about to learn that something extraordinary had happened at Windsor. The palace had hoped to settle the conflict before it escaped Windsor. It failed. By sunrise, the royal dispute had become a national conversation, not because the public knew every private sentence, but because enough of the truth had emerged to create an unmistakable picture. A dinner had been halted. Catherine had been defended. Camilla had demanded an inquiry. And the investigation had uncovered problems far beyond the confrontation she originally wanted examined. Charles authorized a brief palace statement confirming that an internal review had followed a private disagreement at Windsor and that the matter had now been addressed. An internal review, in plain terms, is a formal examination carried out within the royal household to understand what happened and whether procedures were followed correctly. The wording named no culprit, but that restraint only increased the pressure. If the palace had examined administrative procedures at all, then something far more serious than a family argument had occurred. William hated what happened next. Catherine became the center of public sympathy almost immediately, yet every supportive headline forced her back into the humiliation she had wanted to leave behind. The prince understood the cruelty of that contradiction. Public affection could make her feel protected, but it also kept the most painful part of the story alive. Catherine told him quietly that she wanted dignity, not victory. He agreed, but the country had already begun choosing sides. Camilla felt the public narrative closing around her just as quickly. The queen consort knew the private apology had changed the relationship between the two women, but outsiders could not see that. To them, the story appeared simple. Catherine had been humiliated. Anne had intervened, and Camilla's own inquiry had turned toward her household. She feared that one terrible dinner would erase every complicated truth that came after it. Then came the moment that defined the morning. In this fictionalized account, a newspaper front page carried Windsor Castle beneath the headline, "Dinner Ends in Royal Rebuke." Hours later, a broadcaster opened its royal segment by emphasizing that the inquiry requested by Camilla had ultimately scrutinized the very household closest to her. The framing was devastating because it turned the investigation into a symbol of unintended consequences. Catherine experienced that public feeling directly when her car passed through the Windsor gates. A small crowd began applauding. She did not stop, but William noticed immediately. The future king understood that the public had personalized the conflict far beyond palace procedure. Anne wanted none of the praise. In a private conversation with Charles, she told him that presenting her intervention as a triumph would betray the reason she acted in the first place. The king listened because he knew she was right. Someone had to end the cycle of winners and losers. The country wanted a victor. The family wanted closure. And Charles understood that the only lasting solution required rejecting both ideas. Charles's final decision did not banish anyone, strip anyone of status, or pretend the Windsor dinner had never happened. Instead, he closed the inquiry with a judgment aimed at the deeper wound beneath the scandal. Anne had acted outside normal dinner protocol, but her intervention came in response to a genuine personal breakdown. Camilla's demand for scrutiny had been legitimate, yet the review proved that royal authority could never justify humiliation, or the quiet rewriting of events afterward. Charles formally ended the inquiry after determining that Anne would face no sanction for stopping the dinner. The suspended official would be reassigned away from direct briefing duties, removing them from the sensitive chain of information reaching senior royals. A sanction, in simple terms, is an official penalty imposed for breaking rules or accepted procedure. The king wanted the outcome to be clear. The family could not punish the person who interrupted the damage, while ignoring the failures that allowed it to happen. The monarch also introduced a new internal expectation. Serious disagreements between senior royal households would now have to be addressed directly before being filtered through aides. That mattered because this crisis had shown how quickly private hurt could become institutional warfare. Once summaries, interpretations, and defensive loyalties stood between people. Charles had seen what happened when emotion was rewritten into procedure. He was determined not to let that happen again. Catherine accepted Camilla's private apology and asked for nothing more. She did not demand a public statement, a formal admission, or another meeting. Her choice was not surrender. It was a refusal to let humiliation become the defining story of her place within the family. Camilla, meanwhile, withdrew her original demand for action against Anne. The queen consort remained hurt by how the dinner had ended, but she finally accepted why the Princess Royal had acted when Catherine had been left isolated. Anne met Catherine briefly after the inquiry closed. The future queen thanked her for standing up when the room had gone silent. Anne answered that she had done what someone should have done earlier, then deliberately changed the subject. She would not turn protection into personal glory. Charles later spoke privately with William, and revealed through that recorded family conversation what had troubled him most. It was not the disagreement. It was the instinct to soften uncomfortable truths before they reached the sovereign. The king told his son that this was how families and institutions lost trust at exactly the same time. The Windsor crisis ended without a triumphant winner. Anne proved that loyalty sometimes requires interruption. Catherine proved that dignity does not require retaliation. Camilla learned that authority carries responsibility for how power is felt by others. Charles learned that peace built on avoiding truth is not peace at all. The dinner became defining because the family finally chose confronting injury over preserving appearances. Windsor did not emerge untouched, but one principle became impossible to ignore. Royal rank could organize a family, yet it could never excuse humiliation inside it. And with that judgment, the doors of Windsor closed on the conflict, not hiding it, but finally bringing it to an end. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.